Hello, welcome to Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light's October statewide meeting and program. My name is David Hain Menendez, and I am the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light. Today, we are going to address the topic of Build Back Better with Justice. So particularly as a precursor to our annual conference this year, which also focuses on climate justice, we wanted to make a bridge between and inform you about what's going on with the Build Back Better Act, which is obviously a lot in the news as of late. And you probably, if you are in this world, hearing and seeing many emails and other things out there about the Build Back Better Act. But we also wanted, as a climate justice organization, to make sure that one of the most important elements of that act and of the current landscape of climate justice or of environmental work is climate justice, that we give priority to those people who are most directly, immediately, and significantly impacted by climate change, which we describe as frontline communities. With that being said, we do have a wonderful lineup of three speakers who pull from three very different fields, and I do not want to take up more time for myself than otherwise ultimately necessary. So we will start off with Flora Cardoni. She is the field director at Penn Environment and point person on federal climate work. Flora oversees much of Penn Environment's climate and grassroots organizing work, directing staff and mobilizing volunteers around the state to fight climate change and promote good, clean energy policy in Pennsylvania. Before taking on this role, Flora was a member of Green Corp, where she led campaigns to register youth to vote in Arizona and oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline in Iowa. She also directed several door-to-door canvassing offices, around the state on behalf of Penn Environment and Work for Progress. And we always cherish our relationship with Penn Environment, and they are consistently a wonderful partner for PAIPL. Our second speaker then will be Daniel Scheid. He is an associate professor of theology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. His work focuses on interreligious ecological ethics, drawing on Catholic social thought and comparative theology, with particular attention to Catholic Hindu and Catholic Buddhist dialogue. In addition to multiple journal articles and book chapters, he is the author of The Cosmic Common Good: Religious Grounds for Ecological Ethics, which reorients ecological key principles of Catholic social thought, such as the common good and solidarity, and places these in dialogue with Hindu, Buddhist, and American Indian religious traditions. Dr. Scheid has collaborated with various groups at the intersection of religion and ecology, including the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, Catholic Climate Covenant, and Christian Life Community. And last but not least, Mary Beth Manarino, Professor Emerita from Chatham University and clinical psychologist whose work focuses teaching healthcare professionals and community members about the mental health and social justice impacts of climate change and the environmental problems and other environmental problems, and also about individual and communal benefits of healthy connections with nature. So as you can probably discern, we have somebody to discuss the political landscape of what we're dealing with right this second, somebody to discuss the ongoing ethical and moral obligations, landscape, and thought regarding why we do this work and how we need to move forward with it, and then the health implications, particularly as it relates to mental health of climate change and pollution and what the benefits of nature can actually be in our world. So without further ado, Miss Flora Cardoni.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Flora Cardoni, as you just heard, and I'm the field director with Penn Environment. Thank you, David, and everyone at PAIPL for including me tonight and for all of your work. Penn Environment loves to partner with you all. And I'm so happy to see so many folks that I've met through volunteering with Penn Environment on the call as well. And it's so nice to see your faces and thankful for your work too. For those of you who don't know us, Penn Environment is a statewide, people-powered environmental advocacy nonprofit. We, like I'm sure all of you here, believe that everyone should have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, protected public lands to enjoy, and a safe and livable climate powered by 100% clean renewable energy. And we help to make that vision a reality and win real results for our environment by helping to give the public a voice in our environmental debate so that all of our elected officials, at the local, state, and federal level are hearing from us, from the people of Pennsylvania, and not just the polluters and fossil fuel lobbyists who want to maintain the status quo. And this is critically important right now in our effort to tackle climate change and pass this Build Back Better Act. I know all of you here are very committed to climate action and climate justice, so I don't need to tell you that the time to act on climate is now. But of course, for those of us in Pennsylvania, this was made all the more clear this summer as we watched the remnants of Hurricane Ida rain down across our state, bringing unprecedented flooding, tornadoes, destroying homes and vehicles, disrupting and contaminating water, devastating communities, and resulting in tragic and avoidable deaths. And of course, that was just one example of the climate crisis we're experiencing here in the Keystone State, from more extreme heat days and bad air days, more frequent and intense downpours. It's very clear the climate crisis is no longer a distant threat, but rather a present danger. So in the face of the impacts, I know a lot of folks here in Pennsylvania and on this call tonight, and the people that work with us are wondering, what we can actually do to help tackle the climate crisis and bring about more climate justice and a safe and livable climate for ourselves and future generations. And really the good news is that we have a lot of our solutions at our fingertips today, right? We know that to stop the worst impacts of climate change, we need to get off of fossil fuels and reduce our carbon pollution, other greenhouse gases, and transition to a renewable energy future. And we have a lot of levers we can pull to do that today, right? We can increase our use of clean renewable energy. We can expand public transit and multimodal transit like biking and walking. We can transition all of our cars and trucks and buses to run on clean electricity, and we can improve energy efficiency and waste less energy. And those are just a few examples. And luckily, we have a huge opportunity to win some of the largest investments in those and other climate and clean energy solutions that we've ever seen at a federal level before in the budget reconciliation bill that's currently being debated in Congress, otherwise known as the Build Back Better Act. So for those of you who are less familiar, the Build Back Better Act is basically Congress's chance to carry out President Biden's, agenda to rebuild our economy with big, bold investments to spur climate action, clean energy growth, limit pollution from power plants, and reduce pollution from the fossil fuel industry, expand the electrical vehicle market, and create millions of family-sustaining jobs. And it also includes a groundbreaking proposal to make sure that at least 40% of the benefits from those investments go to those frontline communities who are traditionally harmed most by this dangerous pollution and by the fossil fuel industry, as well as those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It also includes a goal of reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. And there's a lot of proposals that could be part of this Build Back Better Act that are still being negotiated. But a few of those include a clean electricity performance program to incentivize utilities to increase the amount of clean energy they provide, expand electric vehicle infrastructure to a nationwide electric vehicle charging infrastructure, invest in clean energy and innovation in communities with grant programs, clean heavy duty vehicles and other electric vehicles and transportation, appliance and building efficiency rebates, a lot of stuff that can help folks, low income solar, replacing lead pipes, a methane fee, and a lot of environmental and climate justice block grants. And those are just a few examples. I know we're particularly excited about clean energy tax credits and incentives, as that's been proven to increase clean energy, as well as the investments for clean vehicles and other clean transit. So we need all of those provisions and more, right, to actually tackle the climate crisis and deliver a livable climate and cleaner air and water and improve health to our communities. So it's incredibly urgent and important that Congress passes the Build Back Better Act with as big and bold and ambitious investments in these and other programs that are needed to tackle the climate crisis, achieve true environmental justice, and accelerate this clean energy transition. The majority of Americans support this. They want bold climate action, the majority of Pennsylvanians as well. And, this is, what we need to do to make sure we all have a livable climate. But despite this widespread public support and the urgency and importance of this moment for climate action, we know that the fossil fuel industry still has an outsized influence on our elected officials. So you may have heard even just today that Joe Manchin and some other members of Congress are feeling the pressure of those fossil fuel lobbyists and are trying to get rid of some of the most important climate provisions in this plan, like the Clean Electricity Performance Plan. There's also a lot of pressure, especially on moderate folks in more purple districts, to just reduce the amount of spending overall, with calls from a lot of folks to take away from the climate and clean energy aspects of this bill. I know we're hearing from offices in more purple districts here in Pennsylvania and around the country that they're getting a lot of calls from folks who are concerned about the overall price tag and want it to be lowered. But really, we need as big and bold and deep investments in climate and clean energy and climate justice as possible. And we know, as I said, that the majority of Pennsylvanians and majority of Americans are with us. So really, it's critically important in this moment as negotiations happen in the next 2 weeks. We hear from DC a deal should be reached by October 31st. So over the next 2 weeks, it's really critically important that all of the members of the PA delegation and, if you have friends in other states around the country, are hearing from you, their constituents. We need everyone to demand that Congress acts now to prioritize the biggest and boldest climate investments possible in this Build Back Better Act, and to do whatever it takes to get their colleagues on board with keeping all of the important climate and clean energy provisions and climate justice provisions in this bill. So I hope that you'll all, of course, make your voices heard. We have one way that you can take action. I'll just drop in the chat for now, which will send an email to your member of Congress that you can edit, but that demands the big, bold investments. And of course, we always encourage folks to email, call your congressional offices, post on social media, get your friends involved, because the more of us who make our voices heard for big, bold climate, clean energy, climate justice investments, the more support our members of Congress will have when they're negotiating in DC, and the more they'll be encouraged to prioritize these provisions and get their colleagues on board. So I definitely encourage you all to make your voices heard, and I'm happy to answer any questions folks have about what's going on politically with Build Back Better.
Thank you so much, Flora.
We'll have time for questions at the end too, so I'll stick around if you think of something later.
Yeah, so we decided that because Flora's obviously has a bit more specific detail to the potential questions that might be asked, that we would allow some people to ask questions as are currently being dropped, I think, in the chat. I see Phyllis has her hand up, but there's also a question in the chat from Karen Reaver already that says, how do we know the majority of residents support climate change initiatives?
Yes, that's a great question. So it's going off of different polling that's been done nationally as well as in Pennsylvania. So we know that 71% of the public supports making investments in climate justice and jobs that President Biden promised. I can link actually a data set if you're interested, polling done in April. And in fact, with the climate events happening this summer, I believe those numbers have even increased. And then there's been different polling done in Pennsylvania specifically. That's also about 70% of folks wanting our elected officials to do more on environmental and climate, to move away from fossil fuels and take action on climate.
And that 71% was nationwide, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe the last significant study that I saw in Pennsylvania was just under 70% for Pennsylvanians, and that ranged from take action to definitely take action. So they usually allow for a gradation, but of those two categories, which definitively said take some form of action, it was almost more than a 2/3 majority of Pennsylvanians. The second question from Kathy, sorry, never mind, that was directed to me. Dan said, is there a top 3 ask for climate justice you would prioritize in the Build Back Better or in general, I guess?
That's a good question. In general, I think some of the things that I'm most excited by, and and it really depends on who you ask. So really, I want everything. But I think it's very important to invest in low income energy efficiency, home weatherization, and that sort of things that saves folks money on their utility bills, as well as lowers energy use. And low income solar and other things that help folks who are most disproportionately impacted by this stuff benefit from the clean energy transition is very important. I'm also just generally across the board excited about clean energy tax credits and incentives, electric vehicle tax credits and incentives that have the potential to benefit everyone.
So obviously, if anybody needs clarification on any of those things, we can circle back to them as well. Phyllis asked,
general, and sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add, in general, if you're looking for a top line, message, just to say to elected officials, I think it's fine to keep it broad and just say you want them to prioritize like the biggest investments possible in climate justice and clean energy, clean transit, fossil fuel, reductions, greenhouse gas reductions. But I've just been saying like big, bold climate action and investments. And if that's the message that they're hearing, that'll go a long way.
Something that I was thinking about earlier was actually, because of how much the economic and job numbers of environmental bills often get tied up with that. I was thinking earlier that I might try to test out, at least in my region, just talking about this as staying competitive, honestly. I've heard recently messaging regarding this is maintenance, meaning that like if you don't do maintenance in 10 years, you will pay twice as much for the same work you could have done for half as much today. I think that's, for me, not a bad argument at all, but I also like the idea that if this will help us stay competitive by investing in our energy grid, in investing in infrastructure, and investing in not just roads and bridges, but all the other things that everybody else is doing, why shouldn't we be doing it? It seems poor in form for American industry to undercut its own long-term sustainable, viable profit margins if you don't have a healthy workforce, don't have roads to drive on, don't have infrastructure to support industry in the first place. So
exactly. And it's really, it's honestly kind of mind-blowing to think that in the year 2021 we're still using centuries old energy sources when other technology has increased so much, right? Like the internet is in our cell phones. Like we've done so much, and yet we're using these old and polluting energy systems that when we have better, cleaner solutions at our fingertips, and certainly other countries are moving forward in solar and electric vehicles in ways that we are not here. So there's definitely a big opportunity.
I always enjoy sharing articles from countries that are major oil producers who are going to solar energy. Mm-hmm. Phyllis asked, how significant is it if we have to drop the clean electrical payment program? So could you maybe unpack the program first a little bit and then address that?
Yes. So the clean electricity payment program, CEPP, is basically a large part of how we'll reach the climate reductions that the Biden administration and scientists want us to reach, reducing pollution by at least 50% by 2030, because it mandates that utilities get more and more of their energy from renewable sources. That is a key policy. And of course, having a really strong CEPP would be great and would really help us transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. And I think that's why a lot of folks in the climate space today, I've been getting a lot of emails from groups saying that we need to fight to make sure this is included. And certainly we know that Joe Manchin is only trying to take that out because of his ties to fossil fuels. However, I think that some of the language is a little hyperbolic because it's not the only good policy that's in the bill. And there are a lot of other good investments and policies in both this Build Back Better Act and even the bipartisan infrastructure bill that would be very big wins and still like the biggest climate investments we've ever seen, clean energy tax credits and more. So even if it's taken out, it's critically important that we pass it and, make sure all those other clean energy investments are being made. But it is also a key policy in this transition. So I think it is a clearer path to getting off of coal and methane gas and going towards renewable energy, but it's not the only way. And certainly if we pass all this other stuff in the Build Back Better Act, there would also be an opportunity to pass something like the CEPP if we can do our work that we're still doing of making the public, the voice heard and making it clear that the American people demand this transition.
Karen commented on her question that you answered earlier and said, yes, I'd like the polls re-climate change investing. I think because you referred to them earlier that you would, I think you dropped it already in the chat maybe.
Yes, that files for Congress, that's one of the polling.
And then she followed up by saying, how do we, if we do, work with the fossil fuel industry in PA to make the transition to clean energy? And do you think there even is a path in that direction?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. There are, of course, opportunities to make sure this transition is a just transition. So Penn Environment, for example, has worked on a 100% renewable energy bill that has a lot of things in there around supporting workers. There's federal provisions as well. If we can pass things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that raise money for the state, that money can be invested into things like worker retraining. So I think it's very important to help protect the folks that have worked in this fossil fuel industry, whether in supporting them in early retirement or job retraining. And a lot of fossil fuel workers can be easily retrained into renewable energy and energy efficiency programs, or like things like cleaning up, like mine reclamation or cleaning up abandoned oil and gas wells. So I think that it's important to work to support those workers and get them on board. I think it's been very difficult, as a lot of folks know, in Pennsylvania, where we have conversations about wanting to increase renewable energy, and they're on board with that, but don't want to get rid of fossil fuel jobs because that's what has sustained them in their communities. So it's been difficult to find a path forward. And I think the more that you can have actual examples of success, where money raised from things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative can be used in actual worker retraining and support programs, that's important, especially when we know that when these transitions aren't planned for, workers are often left in the lurch, as what happened when the Philly refinery closed. So we know things like coal are on the way out anyway, so it's better to plan for that transition, make it happen faster to protect our climate, but also make sure workers are protected. And then I see this last question here about Manchin and Sinema. It's really difficult, Phyllis, to know what they're agreeing to, because basically they just keep saying we want it to be less money without saying things they particularly agree with or support. There was a rumor last week that Sinema wanted climate stuff out, but her office is denying that and saying they want climate stuff in because she sees it's important in Arizona, of course. Manchin is more explicitly asking to take climate things out, like this program. But really, a lot of their opposition is just to the price tag in general and not getting that specific. And I think one thing we can do is just talk to Senator Casey, for example, and encourage him to do whatever he can to get them on board. Because, of course, we need even more than this investment to actually tackle the climate crisis.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Flora. I'm sure that we'll come back for more questions at the end as well after we hear the other presentations. But next up is Dan Scheid from Duquesne. Obviously, everything Flora just said, there's many moving parts to that massive bill. The one thing that I looked up that I just wanted to put out there before you start is I was trying to think of how to put the amount of money in the context of our economy. And since it's paid for over 10 years, obviously it's the 3.5 over 10 years, that is still less than half of what we spend on the military budget per year. And even if we have the military budget, we would still have the largest military budget in the world. So I'm not saying anything about changing the military budget, but putting in the context of where our priorities are, we are spending quite a lot more than $7 trillion in 10 years on the military, but we're not willing to spend 3.5 on climate change, or at least Manchin and others are voting against such a obvious investment in our people. But on that note, please, Dr. Scheid, please take it away.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me here this evening. So as David mentioned in my introduction, I'm a Catholic theologian rooted in principles of Catholic social thought, which is the way that the tradition has talked about various social issues. My other field of interest is interreligious dialogue and comparative theology. So looking for resonances across traditions and trying to find the ways in which various faith traditions are transitioning, if you will, their own traditions to deal with climate justice. So I wanted to raise briefly some principles or themes from religious traditions that I think would be helpful in thinking about the Build Back Better Act. And the first, I think this is, again, preaching the choir, but that the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, is a moral and spiritual crisis. It's not just technological, it's not just economic, it's not just political. It's really a question of moral vision and how we conceive ourselves in relationship to the earth and what kind of responsibility we take for it. So the energy policy, Farm Bill, Build Back Better Act, these are all moral documents. They reflect a certain kind of national moral vision. So the Jewish Earth Alliance draws on that quote from Proverbs, without a vision the people perish. And they argue, quote, we learn from the story of Moses that leaders must have a vision for the future. When Moses stood before the burning bush, he took on the task of leading his people from slavery to freedom. You've been charged with responsibility for the needs of the people. Do not let this opportunity pass without action. I think that corresponds to what Flora was saying, to provoke our elected leaders to be bold with their action. So what is the moral vision that I think religious faiths talk about the human person and the responsibility that we have for climate and for the earth itself? Of course, religious traditions are quite varied and different, but there are some similarities. So on the one hand, with the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we see first and foremost the goodness of creation and the goodness of the creator to whom creation belongs. So in Islam, for example, all creation is considered Muslim. It submits to God's laws. Human beings have a unique dignity and a right to use the goods of the earth. They've been given the responsibility of stewardship. But first and foremost is the sense that everything belongs to God. So the Quran says, do you not realize that to God prostrates everyone in the heavens and everyone on earth, and the sun and the moon and the stars and the mountains and the trees and the animals and the peoples? So the role for the human person is to be a steward of God, to relate to creation as God would. Jews and Christians might look to Genesis to understand what does it mean to be human. In the first book of Genesis, we see over and over again that creation is good. Light is good, darkness is good, the earth is good, the waters are good. In the second creation account, we see that God takes the mud of the earth and blows into the nostrils, so that Adam comes from Adamah, or humans come from humus. The idea being that we belong to this earth. It is a good place and we belong to it. Genesis 2:15 has this primary vocation of this first human being, the Adam. God places Adam in the garden to care and to cultivate the garden. And the words here are shamar and avad. And shamar is to care for, to watch, to observe, and to protect. But in other places in the scripture, God counsels people to shamar Torah. So there is a sense in which we care for and protect, but also we learn from, we study. We're deferential towards this, which we're called to learn from. And then the word to cultivate is avad, to work, but also to work for. Taken more dramatically, Moses says to Pharaoh, we need to go out into the desert so that we can avad the Lord. Now, clearly, they would not countenance worshiping the land, but the idea here again is that the human person has a fundamental priority of responsibility of observing, protecting, and cultivating and working for the world around us. So the Build Back Better plan, any of these national policies cannot lead to prosperity unless we do it in recognition of the limits of the earth, the goodness of the earth, and by knowing that we achieve our prosperity by working with and not over and against the planet. In Hinduism and Buddhism and some of the Eastern traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, we have more of a stress on, say, the unity of life. So in Hinduism, you'd see a focus on dharma. Dharma is that which supports and sustains and upholds, which holds and ties everything together. So dharma is a moral law and a cosmic law. It weaves and sustains the cosmos, society, and the human individual. A key principle of Dharma is the belief that the Supreme Being resides in all beings, all creatures. There are many passages of Hindu scripture that talk about the divine as the innermost reality of any creature. A famous one comes from the Atharva Veda, written about 1500 BC. There's a hymn to Mother Earth, and it celebrates how Mother Earth nourishes us, provides for us, and the prayers invoke her blessing on us. It says, "O Mother Earth, sacred are your hills, snowy mountains, and deep forests. Be kind to us and bestow upon us happiness. May you be fertile, arable, and nourisher of all. May you continue to support all races and nations. May you protect us from your anger." And the commentary here is in the form of natural disasters. "And may no one exploit and subjugate your children." The Buddhist tradition would focus more on the interconnectedness of all beings. The famous Vietnamese Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh, who lives now in France, talks about how all things inter-are, that interbeing is the state of our world today. And he says, if you hold up a piece of paper and you look deeply, you can see a cloud. This isn't just poetic language. Without the cloud, there is no rain. Without the rain, there is no fertile soil. Without the soil, there is no tree. And without the tree, there is no paper. And without healthy air, without healthy water, without healthy land, there is no human person. My own Catholic tradition also talks about interconnectedness. Pope Francis, in his famous document Laudato Si', says, "It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore and understand." We see that, or saw that poignantly with the COVID pandemic. The world and its people are intimately and inextricably linked, and what happens in one area of the world will have repercussions, will come back on other parts of the planet. In indigenous traditions, we have a similar sense of the unity of life and a sense of the responsibility of the person. In the American Indian or Native American traditions that I've looked at, there's a strong sense of responsibility to the land, and then, therefore, to all the beings that inhabit it. George Tinker, a member of the Osage Nation, talks about the vision, the moral vision of the Native peoples, where the members of the community include the animals, the four-leggeds, the birds, all the living, moving things, including rocks, hills, trees, rivers, and so on, along with all the other sorts of two-leggeds, the bears, humans of different colors in the world. Land, for Native Americans, is not purely a resource, something they use as they want, not just a provider of goods for survival. It's not just a possession. It's something that they belong to as well. They exist in a filial relationship, a family relationship of reciprocity. Tinker draws on the Lakota prayer of Metekyasin, which translates roughly into something like all my relations or we are all related. And Tinker comments, every Lakota who prays this prayer knows that our relatives necessarily include the four-leggeds, the wingeds, and all the living, moving things on Mother Earth. Therefore, Metekyasin promotes an ethic of balance and reciprocity. Balance connotes harmony between creatures, not as a final, once and for all done goal, as if we can achieve harmony and then we've finished. No, it's a constant process of balance, and it's a process of constant responsibility and taking awareness of our reciprocity with the rest of creation. One of the key themes that I think religious traditions have been raising up, and I know that Interfaith Power and Light has been doing this prominently, is the interconnectedness of social justice and environmental justice. And Pope Francis in Laudato Si' puts it this way: these are not two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. He says we need to seek strategies that combat poverty and protect nature. A true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And for Catholics, I think that dual phrase of cry of the earth, cry of the poor has really become a centering motif for climate justice and for climate activism. Climate change affects everyone. It hurts the poorest and the most marginalized who did the least to cause it. And one example that brings this poignantly to my mind and the interconnectedness of social and environmental justice was the 2014 death of Eric Garner, an African-American man who died while pinned to the ground in an illegal chokehold by a Staten Island police officer. As he died, many of you will remember, he pleaded, "I can't breathe." His death has become one of the many that are now linked with the Black Lives Matter movement and protests against police brutality. His autopsy revealed that he suffered from asthma, which contributed to his death. Asthma is a disproportionately common disease among African Americans and Latinx peoples in New York City, and they tend to live and work amid high levels of air population. So Garner suffered not only because of racially motivated violence, but also because the air in his community robbed him of a normal quality of life, the right to breathe clean air. We saw under COVID-19 that the pandemic was not born equally. It revealed economic fault lines that fell along predictably racial asymmetries. The affluent could telecommute, while others had to balance health risks versus financial pressures to go to work. Pre-vaccination COVID-19 deaths correlated with air pollution, leading Robert Bullard, a longtime advocate for environmental justice, to say, it's those same communities where we've been fighting against environmental racism for years that are now getting hit hard by COVID. The Jewish Earth Alliance recognizes this, recognizes the call to love to neighbor that runs through all the Abrahamic traditions. And they say, quote, as Jews, we are taught that the essence of our faith is to love our neighbors as ourselves. We cannot stand by as Black, Indigenous, and people of color and low-income communities take the brunt of the harm caused by changing climate. So religious traditions talk profoundly about the goodness of creation and the goodness of Creator, talk about the role of the human as steward and the role to take responsibility, talk about the interconnectedness of all beings, the interconnectedness of social and environmental justice, and then finally the necessity of bringing to light the most marginalized people who bear the brunt of this. The final point I want to make is that religious traditions are calling us to act boldly. And I was already going to say this before Flora spoke. But yes, this requires honesty, courage, and responsibility. Pope Francis in Laudato Si asks politicians to think about their vocation and their purpose in life. He says, what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? Jewish Earth Alliance agrees, act boldly to transition to renewable energy, to remedy the harms caused by environmental justice, and create millions of good green jobs to lift up our families. We know that this kind of politics clashes with present-day economics and politics and with the goal of short-term gain. But if we can appeal to politicians to be courageous, says Pope Francis, they will attest to their God-given dignity and leave behind a testimony of selfless responsibility. To act with justice in mind is to demonstrate one's dignity. The moral will required to respond to climate change and other ecological threats, I think, can come from a faith traditions that have a sense of prayer, of reverence, of humility, of seeing the earth, its ecosystem, and its many creatures as interconnected, perhaps as seeing the earth as mother, as seeing it as loved and cherished by God, seeing it as sisters and brothers and family, and as calling forth our power to care for and to cultivate the earth as a witness to our own basic human dignity. Faith traditions speak these words of challenge: be hopeful and be bold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. So we'll save questions for Dan until after Mary Beth speaks. So I will spotlight her. There you go. Mary Beth obviously has a slightly different background, still academic, still an expert in her field, but I think considering everything we just heard from both Flora and Dan, the imperative should seem very obvious, but maybe the impact seemed sometimes distant, right? When we talk about policy and we talk about the debates of numbers and quantities that barely feel familiar to us in our everyday lives, or when we talk about scripture that doesn't always resonate with everybody, either those of us in this Zoom or obviously those of us that are not on this call. Mary Beth, we're actually seeing your notes as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that the reason that we wanted Mary Beth and someone to speak about the health impacts is because I think, as Dan suggested, we can very clearly see how that affects the everyday life of ourselves, of those around us, of communities, both of color and frontline communities, that it's something that we can't simply just let people have this impact in their everyday lives. But I'm so happy to have Mary Beth here to speak more about her perspective and the work that she does. So without further ado, thank you, Mary Beth, for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me come, and thanks to Kathy and David, and to Flora and Dan for the excellent foundation that leads right into some important things that I wanted to focus on. This mandate from all religious traditions and from communities that Flora was talking about to care for and protect the earth is so profound. And what I'd like to talk about is what actually happens to humans. How does our neglect of that mandate show up in human well-being or lack of well-being when we don't do what we're supposed to do to protect the earth? So this is very timely. Many of you have probably seen this study that is under peer review for the Lancet Planetary Health Journal, where over 10,000 young people from ages 16 to 25 across 10 different countries from both the global north and the global south were surveyed about their beliefs about climate change and their emotions and feelings to our failure to act in a substantive way to address it. And 59% are very or extremely worried. These are young people about climate change. 84% at least moderately worried. Over half of them felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. Over 45% said their feelings about climate change negatively affect their daily life and functioning. And so that's just one group among all humans, but it's a critical group of people, the 16 to 25-year-old people who are making decisions about their futures in the face of not even uncertainty. There's a certainty that things are going to get very hard. And what I'll talk about are reactions and mental health experiences, mental experiences, psychological experiences that people of all kinds are having in response to what's going on with the climate crisis and with our failure to address it successfully. So the disruptions that we experience related to the climate crisis fall into two different overlapping categories. One are the discrete events that occur, like the hurricanes and the fires out west. And the other is this chronic, ongoing environmental deterioration. The first type of climate crisis event tends to get a lot of media attention, and it's really easy for us to imagine how people who undergo those experiences would have mental health consequences from them. It's harder to recognize, and it gets less media attention, but it's harder to recognize these slow, ongoing climate events like droughts, rising sea levels, rising temperatures, how those might result in problems with mental health, but they do. And so what these events strike particularly vulnerable populations, which Dan referred to and Flora referred to as well. And these are the ones that we really need to focus on justice issues with them. Those who have pre-existing mental or physical health conditions, BIPOC and other marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities and individuals who struggle economically are hit harder, very young, very old, youth and young adults, pregnant and nursing people, people without houses and shelters, communities and individuals whose livelihoods are immediately land dependent, individuals and communities who live in close proximity to sites of climate change or environmental deterioration, as Dan referred to the Eric Garner situation. And then healthcare professionals and first responders, environmental activists, all of these groups are particularly vulnerable to having mental health challenges related to climate change and the failure to act on it. We're all familiar with anxiety, depression, substance abuse. People who suffer from these conditions will likely see and do often see an exacerbation of their symptoms when they are exposed to the environmental degradation and climate change events that I mentioned. We will also see an increase in prevalence of these conditions, such that people who may never have really experienced them before will end up showing up in therapists and counselors' offices for the first time with such conditions. What's also unique is that we have specific mental health experiences that are related to climate change. And these arise from this toxic soup of disruptions to healthcare that are brought on by climate events, disruptions in food access, in education, transportation, housing, the ability to earn a living, and even citizen status, where you have to move because of to immigrate elsewhere because of what's going on in your country related to climate. So there's a whole constellation of mental health experiences that people have related to this toxic soup, in addition to those who have pre-existing conditions that get exacerbated. There's all kinds of grief that people feel. We're often calling it eco-grief. Solastalgia is a term that they use in Australia to refer to the grief that you experience when you're living somewhere that's deteriorating around you. And that is a different kind of grief than we might have in other situations. Sadness, despair, hopelessness, and helplessness are often described as reactions to what's going on. A word that has been coming up during COVID that I've heard an awful lot in relation to COVID, and also I hear this related to the climate crises, is overwhelm. Just that there's too much for people to take in, and they just feel almost numbed out by it, afraid and anxious. The interesting thing about the anxiety and the grief is that they often come before there's actually some kind of devastating climate event. I was visiting Banff in Canada a few years ago, and we visited some glaciers there where we were shown how far they had receded in the last 20 years. And I not only felt grief for that, but a horrible grief and terror at what I knew was ahead. And so the anxiety and the grief are often about things that we're not yet seeing, but we know are coming. When I teach graduate students in counseling psychology about these issues, they describe having a foreshortened future, a sense that my life isn't going to be as long or as healthy or as productive as past generations. And they describe an existential dread that, you know, what is the purpose that I can find in this when things are going so bad. Many of them discuss decisions not to have children. I have had some students who have quit school because they don't want to incur the debt, and they're pessimistic about being able to find jobs anyway. Guilt and shame sometimes arises among people who feel like they've contributed in particular ways to what's going on. Denial and avoidance, we see that just as we have seen it with COVID. every bit as incapacitating as actually feeling the feelings of having to face this big challenge. First responders and healthcare professionals and activists often experience vicarious trauma, secondary trauma. When I've been participated in different kinds of actions, it's been important. I'm thinking of some related to mountaintop removal mining that I participated in. They always have a mental health person or a chaplain available because there is trauma associated with watching what's going on in the environment in which the protests are taking place. An experience of collective trauma where whole communities are overwhelmed and in distress. And this does not get enough attention, positive experiences of joy, satisfaction, camaraderie, and so forth that come from tackling the problems associated with the climate crisis. So we have this toxic soup that has been described, and that is the soup related to problems with healthcare, food access, transportation, and so forth, is related to the climate crisis, to the dependence on fossil fuels, but it's also all mixed up. It's because we're all connected with income inequality that pre-existed this climate crisis, with racism, with all kinds of debilitating social structures that just feed in and knit together with the climate change events, so that it makes things particularly challenging in terms of individuals' well-being. So one of the things that's important to think about is that these are not individual problems. The field of psychology and psychiatry has not always done a very good job of understanding the context in which these problems arise: anxiety, depression, grief, and so forth. But we have to recognize that these reactions, these mental health experiences that people are having in response to climate events, are not individual pathologies. They're understandable psychological responses to real situations that people are reading accurately. And so there is no way that we can address the mental health issues related to climate through just individual therapy or family therapy. We have to take a holistic approach that includes ethical, legal, political, cultural interventions and actions, in addition to mental health care if that's what's needed. So we experience both individual and collective distress and trauma, and lots of actions that we can take. We won't get into tonight because I know we're running out of time, but we do need to, if we're talking about mental health issues, we need to educate the people who are providing that kind of health care about climate issues and how to integrate that into both assessment of the problems and treatment of problems. We need people who are experienced in understanding how change happens on a social level, who know about trauma, social action, and people who are really good at interprofessional and interdisciplinary collaboration. And I'll just say a couple of more things. I look ahead to thinking about how will we address these problems if they get much worse, if we don't turn things around. In terms of healthcare, we're going to need communities to really support the individuals within the communities who are suffering on a smaller scale than a big citywide or statewide healthcare system. We're going to have people who are closer to the ground who can provide support. And I'm not sure what that will look like, but I think that people from different disciplines and different professions will need to work together to figure out how to do that. It's both an inner and outer kind of work that we have to do. Joanna Macy is so good at talking about the inner work that we do in being present and sitting with the pain and fear and concern about what's going on around us. But in doing that with other people and sitting with that, you find the energy and the joy that is necessary for addressing what's going on. And so I will end there and open it up for questions. Turn it back over to David for any questions that might come up.
Hello, thank you. I am going to stop your sharing. There you go. And I am going to bring a few of us into the spotlight. Yeah. Why can't I spotlight Dan? Add spotlight. There you go. So I know that Tim already dropped at least a comment question in the chat. Tim, would you like to unmute and ask it directly?
Okay. You want me to just basically read what I wrote?
Yeah, unless you have anything that changed from what you initially said.
No. There needs to be action that brings people close to hope. Is there any significant effort on the part of climate mental health professionals to bring hope into the perspective of suffering people?
Can I take that question? That's an excellent question. In reality, we don't have huge numbers of mental health professionals who would say that they're competent in even addressing climate issues when they come up. They might not even ask about it. They might not ask about access to green spaces, quality of water, things like that. They just have not been educated in it. And so we actually are having a big day-long conference here in Pittsburgh in early November where we're bringing together all kinds of mental health professionals with community activists to try to help people feel more competent in recognizing when this is impacting people. Now, I think apart from climate, most of us do try to find ways to engender hope for the future with all of the clients that we work with. And as for myself, what I try to bring to people is that, man, working on it with well-motivated people is some of the most satisfying work that you'll ever do in your life. And you can feel joy and satisfaction, even if you haven't reached the outcome that you're aiming for, just by knowing you're doing the right thing and working for positive change and being consistent with the ethics and the morals that Dan talked about. And yeah, so I'll stop there, and if somebody else wants to weigh in, I would really welcome.
Yeah, I wanted just to add quickly, I mean, as someone who experiences my own existential dread around climate change, I certainly find that doing this work every day and knowing I'm trying to make a difference helps a lot. Working alongside other people who care and building that community so you don't feel so alone in it. And then in our advocacy, we really try to focus on solutions like renewable energy and this vision of a better world with clean air and clean water and, you know, a livable climate, and then giving people an actionable thing they can do to feel like they're making a difference, are some things that I find help inspire hope and connection.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of research on hope in this perspective, in this context. And one of the most interesting articles I read divided the ways in which we can engender hope in others and in ourselves into three different categories. And one of them was, the first one was just the plain old facts, the science of climate change and what can we do. And, there's plenty of evidence that we can do a lot right now. The second one was particularly relevant to this particular program because it had to do with the philosophical connection that we have, almost a visceral spiritual connection that we have to the earth and to reality and to the greenery of our lives when we walk in the forest, and just the whole connection that we have with physical reality and the beauty of it. And then the third had to do with our individually taking action. When we take action, we build hope. And it is the combination of those three that really can produce the results that requires hope. So I just wondered if anybody had professionally taken on the task of trying to bring that into the whole sphere of climate change and what to do about it.
When I've trained psychologists and counselors about this, we talk about ways to balance out addressing the angst associated with climate change to developing a real appreciation and love for nature. And that in and of itself can be very healing. And as Wendell Berry says, until you know and love a place, you're not necessarily going to protect it, but you'll be much more likely to protect a place that you've fallen in love with. And I think that is very healing. Those are really good points.
I also do appreciate that, not as much in the United States, but especially elsewhere, there are more and more health professionals who are prescribing nature as, at very least, a supplement to therapy and medications because of the potent nature of that connectivity in the everyday lives of so many millions of people who really don't have that time to take a walk or go fishing or do something that's not sitting in front of their desk. And I think that, to Dan's point also, like, that obviously has spiritual and physical medical impacts on our lives at the same time. I would also think that to add to Mary Beth's wonderful talk, that, as she said, like, so many people are not trained in this yet, but I wonder if then there is a place for those that are trained, like yourself, to train others, but also I think to speak to kind of more the structures of power that exist. So like the people that Flora is essentially petitioning, because I think that there are very few municipal officials or state officials or federal officials that hear much about the mental impact. And I think that, especially in our current moment, especially related to the pandemic, and a term that I've been hearing passed around a little bit more also is syndemic, where you combine structural poverty with the pandemic itself, with the exacerbation of mental health crises that already existed as well, and that the synchronicity of those three elements compound each other all the more, so that maybe there's a role for public health officials and mental health officials to kind of speak that truth to power. And I think, at least from my perspective from PIPL, going off of Dan, that's, in my mind, a little bit of the role of the spiritual leaders. That if you have a space on the pulpit to speak to people, if people are coming to you because they can't afford therapy, or they have a taboo about therapy, or language barriers about therapy and all of this, or a lack of access to green space, that's, in my mind, that's where faith and community come in. And I think that community has an ultimate role in this. And I think a thread that I noticed in all of what you're saying is, like, we can't do this alone. There is no possibility to combat climate change by ourselves. There is no capacity to heal ourselves and the earth by ourselves. I was hoping that Bill would raise his hand. Bill, yes, you wanted to talk?
Thank you, David. I guess my question concerns the the fact that people, as they experience deteriorated conditions or loss of a beautiful nature or beautiful environment, tend to adjust to that, and just it comes to be seen as normal. I mean, I'm an older person, and I think back to when I was young, and monarch butterflies were prolific. I mean, you saw them all over, or seeing huge flocks of migrating birds. And those things just aren't out there now. So a kid who's never seen a monarch is never going to miss seeing a monarch. Maybe they'll see a picture in a picture book, but they'll never have actually experienced it, and so it won't be seen as a loss. And it seems to me that's a psychological thing. We all try to adjust to what we're experiencing so we don't go crazy. But at the same time, it seems to be a deterrent to action. If somehow we could be aware of what we're losing and keep that in the forefront of our minds, we'd be more likely to be active and engaged on these issues.
There's a term that I've seen about that called generational amnesia, that you only know what you know, and you can't fully imagine what it was like before for former generations. But it does make it tricky, doesn't it? It makes it really tricky. People don't know exactly what they've lost.
I wonder if that compounds some of the mental health elements, though, because like if you do feel the loss,
yeah,
just in the way in which you might lose your homeland, a sense of home in the first place, or a loved one, you might for decades feel. I do hear people express that, you know, like, oh, I wish I could go swimming in that stream which is now so polluted, or I wish that forest still existed because I used to go for walks with my father there. You know, there's that sense of loss, and most of us, I think, just chalk it up to things change, you know, progress happens, that type of stuff. But maybe there's a deeper kind of root to that where it kind of strikes at the heart of us. There's 3 participants with hands now. I don't know who was first, Patricia or Joan, whichever one wants to unmute faster.
Patricia, to speak at both feelings of loss and feelings of regeneration. I've been feeling very bad because in my neighborhood, so much of the wildlife has simply disappeared. The rabbits, we still have some squirrels, but the rabbits, the sloths, the groundhogs, all of that used to be in our backyard, you just don't see anymore. And yet yesterday I was hiking the football field in Roxborough. There were 3 deer in the football field. And they were having a great time eating all the grass and everything in the football field and didn't seem to be afraid of me at all. And they were really enjoying it till some other people came to run around the field. And they finally left, but they were beautiful. And it was so wonderful to actually see that much nature in the neighborhood again.
Isn't it funny that towards the beginning of COVID, when suddenly like flocks of birds, sea life, other wild animals just started like reclaiming parts of cities? And Patricia, I mean, I know Roxborough well because I largely grew up there. I mean, that's one of the greener spots of the city. So imagine one of the least green ones. It's funny, like sometimes I meet in the school district students who barely know what animals live just outside the city because they've just never seen them. I mean, they've seen them in a book, but then they're so fascinated like by a groundhog, and they just like light up and freak out that such an animal exists and runs around in nature. Joan, you were next.
Thank you very much, David. Actually, my cat ran across the keyboard and hit the raise hand button. But this is what my cat evidently wants me to say, and that is, I own a property about 10 acres out in Lebanon, Connecticut. And I very much value, to the extent that I have overextended myself financially, getting the septic system redone and having the shore dredged out and changing other things that need to be changed in the drainage so that, you know, the house doesn't get flooded on the whole first floor with all these new catastrophic climate events and heavy rainstorms and so forth. But I still have it. And that is really important to me. And, you know, I'm keeping it so that my children can hang on to that sense of what we had. And it really is a sense of what we had, because we used to have ice beginning before Thanksgiving and going all the way until Easter time. And we used to have tremendous flocks of geese that would come and stay on the pond until it froze over, and they quack all night, gossiping. And they need to know that this is going to be part of our life, in spite of the fact that it's really different from the way that it was, because we'll never go cross-country skiing across the snow, across the pond, or clean off a spot where we can play ice hockey. But we still have the place. And I think all three of us would be doing much worse during this past 10 years, since I actually haven't lived there, but I have a good tenant who's taking care of us, just to have that to hang on to. So whatever that's worth, I think that's what my cat wanted me to say.
Yeah, I was, while I was preparing for tonight, and then also during the individual talks, I was trying to think of a quote to end with, and this struck me earlier, and I wasn't remembering who the singer was, but as a cultural historian, I find solace and prayer within cultural forms, because I find poets speak to the same sacred knowledge that philosophers and theologians do. And I looked up the lyrics just now, and I didn't realize, and this dates me for sure, that the original lyrics were Joni Mitchell. And many of you may actually know this song, but they paved paradise and put up a parking lot.
Oh yeah, sure.
With a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hotspot. Doesn't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. They took all the trees and put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 to see them. I think growing up, I always appreciated those lyrics, because I thought, isn't that an arboretum? But then at the same time, I think, having grown up now, I appreciate more and more, as I see in places like Roxborough, where I grew up, and elsewhere, forests just cut down. And one of the things that we opposed, as the Pittsburghers may know, is the establishment of this Amazon site out in the Pittsburgh suburbs, which is massively going to pollute the area that already had high particulate matter in the air, and then also is just cutting down something in the realms of 1,500 trees, when there are brown sites all in around Pittsburgh that could have just been repurposed. But instead, they're literally chopping down the trees to make a massive parking lot and a shipping facility for stuff that probably we don't need, that is also then pumping carbon emissions into the air in their production. So I don't want to end on that negative note, but I do appreciate very much the talks that each of our speakers tonight gave. They were all wonderful. And I think that I really like seeing the ways in which three dynamic and different approaches can really uplift the work that we're all doing. Obviously, here and now, there is the political need, right, to get these things passed. We are making calls to literally people in Mansions District. So if anybody wants to join us in that, we would very much appreciate that. We have a list of West Virginians that we're calling. If you, as Flora said, there are many ways in which you can write letters, send emails, text messages, things like that. Mary Beth and Dan, we appreciate you so much. And I definitely, now that we've been introduced, want to come back to you time and time again. You will definitely hear from PAIPL in the near future, because people with your perspective and voice are so needed in this work. And I think that as PAIPL is an interfaith organization, and I appreciate how much faith and mental health have a connection in many ways, that we will definitely draw upon your skills and expertise in the near future. I don't know if there's any further questions, but I do realize that we are running out of time. So unless there's any burning question, I think that I will probably end us shortly, unless there's any other cats or pets that want to speak up.
Yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to say, and
Yes.
and thanks for organizing this, David. This was really cool, and hi, Flora. But nature, 8 o'clock, WPBS. That's so important to me, and all the people who watch it here at this community, continuous care community where I live. Talk about the things that we see. We talk about them every week and how important they are. And, we're never going to go at this point, any of us, to see elephants or to see polar bears or anything like that. But we can hang on to knowing that they're there and care about the fact that they're still there and contribute to the charities that are helping to make sure they survive. And also encouraging our grandchildren to look at these things so that they will value them, so that they will be aware of what they are and do what they can to get there and see it, and then to try to see what they can do to hang on to it. And I was also thinking about the Lost Bird Project, which we have now here at Penn State. We have 3 or 4 of the statues that are going to be here. And there are going to be lectures talking about, these birds and the changes in ornithology, what bird species are getting scarce and what ones, don't exist here anymore, although they may exist other places. So I appreciated thinking about that, that there are things we can do to avoid this kind of reality that we never knew, or that our kids never knew, or that we hardly knew, if we make sure we are exposed to it and do something about trying to hang on to it.
Yeah,
that's it.
Thank you so much. So also just keep in mind that this is recorded, and you will all get an email very shortly, probably within the next week or two, with a link. So if you'd like to share it out further, it will eventually live on our YouTube channel, and there are other prior presentations from other statewide monthly meetings, as well as from chapter meetings that offer programs. Not all chapter meetings are recorded and not all offer programs, but when they do, we do record them, send them out, and they are welcome. All people are welcome to those specific chapter meeting programs, at least. The meetings are usually private just for the members of those chapters, and then the programs are kept for everybody else. I also just wanted to add in, other than our conference and many other things that we're doing, we also are sending out a survey to some of the regions to get feedback about what people want, how they want to be involved, and so forth. So you will be seeing that, or you'll actually be getting a phone call potentially from myself or a board member in the very near future. And lastly, we have a great number of different creation care projects that are going on. One we're calling the Blueberry Project, which is out in Pittsburgh, where we're giving out and planting blueberry trees in urban communities. Another is our partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where this year, we planted 10,000 trees alone across the the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then also in Philadelphia, we've planted some trees over the last several years, and we have at least 3 potential tree planting events in the next 6 months, 2 of which will be in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So if you are interested in any of those, or even if you just like trees and want one for your own property or park or street or something like that, we can provide you with trees one way or another. We can connect you. So please feel free to reach out to myself or one of my colleagues. And thank you again to all of the speakers. It was really quite a pleasure to hear from all of you. I give you back the rest of your evening and send you on your way. Blessings to all.